ilintay baroodsi ihandareeti lanwiilma bohora beenaha ogaade ilintay baroodsi ihandareeti lambal maraw ibirime mabadbadiya lambal maraw ibirime mabadbadiya akaba banashi.
Thank you all very much indeed. I feel truly honoured that you would invite me to come to speak at the opening of this historic meeting. And it's quite a historic day for the UK because William Hague, the Foreign Secretary, is in Mogadishu today. And I can... After many, many long years of working myself in the Foreign Office before I went to Chatham House, I think I can honestly say that I can't recall any occasion when the Foreign Secretary went to Mogadishu. Development secretaries sometimes went, or junior ministers, but it really is quite an unusual event, and so it's a fortunate thing that you're also meeting here in London in this way. I wanted to just say a little bit about the work that's been done at Chatham House. Chatham House is a think tank, and its purpose is to provide a forum where people can come together to discuss contested issues, but it's an organisation that doesn't take a stance on anything. It doesn't take sides with anybody. During the time I've been there, I wanted to keep attention focused on the problems of Somalia because sometimes they get forgotten about or neglected in the competition of other international problems. And I wanted as far as possible to make it at Chatham House a place where Somalis from the diaspora could meet and discuss and help policymakers in London to understand the very difficult situation in Somalia from their own perspective and with their own insights. So I think we were able to provide a neutral space with many different and conflicting views there, but it was non-partisan. And if it was committed to anything, it was just committed, if possible, to find ways that would work towards peace in the Horn of Africa generally, but of course including Somalia. I should come clean and say I've finished my association with Chatham House, although I'll continue to be involved there. But during the time that I was there, I helped to build up a programme which will be continuing with others involved in future. Now, a little bit about the situation of Somalia today. There have been immense sufferings, as I hardly need to tell you, and particularly terrible hardship due to the drought last year. We know also that there are severe problems of providing assistance during the drought and humanitarian crisis, particularly in the areas where the Shabab had been in control. At the same time, there's the transitional federal government, which has now been in existence since 2004, with 2 extensions, but it's still not really able to provide government or governance in many parts of the country, including the areas that we're particularly concerned about today. The TFG still has to depend on AMISOM for its security, but the situation is different in other parts of the country. In the north of the country, in Puntland and in Somaliland, Somalis have been able to reconcile with one another and negotiate a much more secure environment. And I think that the international community is coming to understand that peacemaking in Somalia has got a particular character, and that working with those communities who can reconcile and build peace together might be at least part of the answer, not just putting all the effort into the central government. Now, if we think about the international community, and what I was doing at Chatham House really was partly to try to be a bridge, I think, between people who had international concerns and Somali people who were living through these very hard times themselves. The international concerns are not always identical to the concerns of the real people. There are concerns about Jabab and radicalization and possible recruitment, not just in Somalia, but even among Somali communities abroad. And Western countries have also been very worried about the threat to shipping coming from piracy. And some calculations about the cost of the piracy problem and the shipping has been that it might be costing as much as $5 to $8 billion, the cost of countering piracy. The Western countries have been footing the bill for AMISOM, which is an expensive undertaking. I think that the sums at the moment are in the region of about $800 million. And then there was a similar amount has been spent on humanitarian assistance. So there are a whole number of interventions by the West which are costly, but they haven't yet delivered anything like the kind of peace and stability or even the safety of the high seas that I think people would like to see. Now, I wanted to look backwards a little bit and to ask how it is that Somalia has got into this situation of breakdown and why it's lasted so long. I take the view that there were weaknesses in the original design of the Somali state. The Somali state that was founded in 1960 had got some particular features that made it, gave it some weaknesses. One of those was the mismatch between the boundaries of the nation, which spreads, as you know, into northern Kenya and Ethiopia and into Djibouti. The mismatch between the boundaries of the nation and the boundaries of the state. And I think that made statehood a bit problematic in Somalia in a way that it wasn't in many other countries. And the other thing I'd highlight is that it was a country made up of two parts with two different colonial traditions. So there was a combination of the Italian legacy and the British legacy in one new country. And I think that this was more complicated than a colonial inheritance where a single system was passed to the successor country. And I think it's made the legal framework and the administrative framework weaker than it might have been elsewhere. Later on, we have to consider too the nature of the government, particularly after the 1969 coup. From that time onwards, there was a very clear manipulation of clan by the central government. There was the loss of democracy and the loss of public accountability started right back in 69, so that's already 40 years. There were very weak institutions under a revolutionary government, and the legal framework was weak as well for the same reason. And there was very little in the way of protection of citizens' rights. So although we normally talk about the collapse of Somalia or the real breakdown starting from 1991 and the departure of Siad Barre, actually that long period of his rule was one that really undermined a lot of systems and institutions that were needed for a transition and are still lacking in Somalia's case. The other factor is what we could call the bad neighbourhood. Wars with neighbours squandered human and material resources in Somalia, and the defeat in the Ogaden War in 1977-78 produced a huge influx of refugees who had to be accommodated, and that changed some of the political dynamic inside the country too. And it opened the door to subversion from the neighbours, because of course there was still lingering hostility on the part of Ethiopia, and Ethiopia backed opposition movements so that they were armed movements and they were clan-based movements. So that by the time the era of the Siad Barre state came to an end, the country was already deeply fragmented along these lines with armed groups, clan groups, weak institutions, and very poor framework of protection for the citizens of the country. And that's in a way that problem still remains for Somalis to solve today. And one of the factors that I think I myself wasn't so aware of, but I've become more aware of in looking at trying to understand this problem in recent years, is that the inequalities inside Somalia meant that some communities have been much less able to defend themselves and protect their livelihoods and their resources than other communities. And this is part of the challenge for the future in Somalia, that those inequalities and those rights of all citizens should be addressed in a future dispensation. And they remind us how important it is to create new state structures where citizenship isn't just protected by minority groups, but defended really by the state, by the state that we hope can be built. Now, the other reason, so those I would say are the foundations of why the country has found it so difficult to recover. I think the other factor has been the way that the international community has tried to help. I don't think that these efforts have necessarily been ill-intentioned, but the outside countries have tended to try to find military solutions which haven't succeeded, and they've tried also to create a government or impose a government which hasn't been acceptable to or accepted by the Somali people over whom it was supposed to rule. The regional actors, the neighbouring countries, have become progressively more important in the Somali equation, and I think what we see now is really a regionalised conflict in which the efforts of a whole raft of people beyond Somalia's borders are needed to build a safer place and create a new setting in which Somalis can recover. So the state building from the top down didn't really work. And the transitional federal government fundamentally saw itself as being accountable to international donors, to an international community or the UN, rather than being accountable to the people in the country. We also saw in 2006-07 that Ethiopia's military intervention, although they're a very powerful country, it also didn't bring peace. So we're moving now, I think, on the side of the international community, is moving towards new approaches which recognise that, or I hope they are anyway, I should say, recognising that Somalis themselves need to reconcile and to create the government institutions that are accountable to them and not accountable to outside factors or outside players, and that the decentralised authorities that have appeared in different parts of Somalia already may be a more productive route to stability than just focusing on the establishment of a government in the capital. The London conference is going to take place on 23rd of February, and I hope that the British government's going to be able to use that occasion to re-energise international efforts to get Somalia out of the rut that it's been in now for a very long time. It's very important not to give up on Somalia. It is going to come right. Of course it's going to come right. But the way that it needs to come right involves the international players really engaging fully with Somalis who have got the solutions and can build those solutions themselves. Thank you.